Prior to the 1930s in America, there were orphan trains. Roughly 200,000 children were transferred across the country. Some were immigrant children who came from all over the world, but were they truly orphans, or were their parents poverty-stricken or ill and separated at Ellis Island? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Adoptions have taken place as long as humans have walked the earth. Adoption was common during the Roman Empire, but many children who were abandoned were picked up and used as slaves. After the fall of Rome, cultures in that region did not view adoptions favorably. They denounced the practice, so a rise of homeless children took place. This marked a shift in their society. During these times, abandoned orphans were left on the steps of churches. Without the support of the wealthy, the ministry created rules to ban the sale, exploitation, and rearing of abandoned children. Even though children were rescued from the streets, they spent their lives in servitude to institutions and were raised by monasteries. This created the first adoption system in European history. Abandoned children were now given moral, legal, and social standards for life. Orphans became students of the church. This practice continued into the 19th century. It was a transitional phase for adoption. In the 1800s and early 1900s, due to wars, famine, and illnesses, such as the influenza pandemic of 1918, there was a breakdown in societies. Gaps amongst the poor and wealthy were growing. Poverty, death, and malnutrition increased in Northern America and Europe. The number of abandoned children grew. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 is one example. The Irish population fell from 8.4 to 6.6 million people during those years. The population continued to decline throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The decline in population continued to fall in the early 1900s. It fell from 6.6 million to 4.4 million between 1851 and 1911. But this decline in Ireland was due to Irish immigrants who moved to America and to Europe to escape death. Due to the influx in population in America, in 1850, as many as 30,000 children were homeless on the streets of New York City alone. Many children on the streets would be put in jail with hardened criminals for running with gangs or sleeping on the streets at night, many as young as 5 years old. Children who were 6 and older were often put into the workforce in exchange for a roof over their heads. These young children were servants, field hands, machine operators, doing manual labor. Some were maimed or killed in accidents while working. Private charitable groups established 56 children's institutions in the U.S. between 1830 and 1850. Orphanages were seen as a stable solution to a socioeconomic problem, but many felt as though the rich used the institutions of children as a means to control the poor by isolating the children from their own families and using coercive tactics to force children into an obedient and labor mentality. Child labor laws did not exist, and children were used as workhorses. There was clearly two opinions formed. Orphanages served the population of children whose parents were having difficulty providing for them with adequate care. Out of the children brought to the orphanages, studies showed that between 1847 and 1869, only 27% of children lost both parents. 69% had one parent deceased or absent, equally divided amongst mothers and fathers, and 4% had both parents deceased or absent. One report showed many children were in the facilities for less than a year. A large number of the orphans returned home to families and friends, but 32% of these children were placed as indentured servants. Due to social welfare activists, orphan asylums began promoting adoptions based on heartfelt relationships rather than working relationships for these children. Child adoptions were placed under an agreement to provide care for them as family members instead of under contracts for apprenticeship or farm hands. Most likely, this philosophy contributed to the enactment of the first modern adoption law in 1851. Sister Irene, born Catherine Rosamond Fitzgibbon, May 12th of 1823, was an American nun who founded the New York Foundling Hospital in 1869. In those days, abandoned infants were routinely sent to homes for the poor, sickly, and insane. The first home she created was in a brownstone on E 12th Street in Manhattan, where babies could be left anonymously in a receiving crib with no questions asked. The Foundling Hospital came to occupy a full city block between 68th and 69th Street due to the sheer number of infants who needed care. She also founded St. Anne's Maternity Hospital at 13 East 69th Street. Sister Irene is among the pioneers of modern adoption, establishing a system to board out children rather than institutionalize them. The Orphan Train movement was a welfare program that transported children from the East Coast of the United States, from large cities to homes in rural Midwest and further west. The orphan trains operated between 1854 to 1929, relocating around 200 to 250,000 children. Co-founders of the Orphan Train movement claim that these children were orphaned, abandoned, homeless, abused, and displaced, but many of these children belonged to new immigrants and children of poor families who were living in the cities. The orphans were not always placed with the proper people. Background checks were poorly conducted, the orphan train societies were severely understaffed, follow-ups on these children were neglected at times, agents were supposed to perform welfare checks on each child once a year, and children were required to write letters twice a year to describe their experience to the establishments. The New York Foundling Hospital that Sister Irene operated, as well as the Children's Aid Society of New York City, founded by the Protestant minister Charles Loring Brace, and the Children's Village, initiated and organized the orphan trains. The trains traveled across 45 states. Much of the funding was from wealthy members of society as acts of charity. Some of the prominent people donated from the kindness of their hearts, but decisions made on behalf of these children were not always just. It was a two-edged sword. The city was overrun with homeless children, so the plan was set in place. This was a form of fostering children. The new parents were not required to legally adopt the children. It was known as placing out. Some children found loving homes and others were worked to the bone, treated as ranch hands, abused, or looked down on. Typical orphan train cars carried 30 to 40 children. The children ranged from newborns to teenagers. 2 to 5 guardians traveled with them. When they arrived in each new city, they would dress them in new clothes to make a good impression. The children were told they were traveling west, but that was it. Some children were paired with new parents prior to arriving in the towns, but many were put on display where they stood on platforms in the center of town or local meeting spots. Their inspections would begin. It resembled livestock auctions. Children were poked and prodded to check their muscle mass. Their teeth were counted. Some children would sing or dance in hopes of being chosen. Infants were easily placed if healthy. Newspapers wrote about them, quote, "Some ordered boys, some ordered girls, some preferred light babies, others dark," reported by the Daily Independent of Grand Island, Nebraska in May of 1912. Another article stated, "They were very healthy tots and as pretty as anyone ever laid eyes on." An article in Bonham News out of Texas, November 19, 1898, it states, "There were good-looking boys, handsome boys, and smart boys all waiting for homes. Willing and anxious hearts and hands were here to take them and share their all with them through life." Siblings were sent out together for adoption, but not all were adopted together. New parents were often strapped financially and could not take more than one child. Many children lost track of their siblings. This was not a perfect system. Some children found good homes and others were tortured and abused. There was a survey in 1910 that stated that 87% of the children from the trains had indeed done well, while the other 13% returned to New York, died, or had been arrested. I want to share with you individual stories of children who were on the orphan trains, how their lives progressed after they were placed. These are the stories of the orphan train riders. 2 orphan train boys who were taken to Noblesville, Indiana, from Randall's Island Orphanage in New York City, grew up and became governors. One for North Dakota and one for the Alaskan Territory. These stories come from the National Orphan Train Complex, and it's orphantraindepot.org. Our first story is about Governor John Green Brady. John was born June 15, 1848 in New York City. During his early childhood, his mother passed away. His father remarried, and John ran away from home at the age of 8 years old. Legend has it that John was found living on the streets in New York by Teddy Roosevelt Sr. So they placed John in a home for boys on Randall's Island. During those years, he met a friend named Andrew Burke. In January of 1859, John was taken in by the Children's Aid Society. John was selected as an orphan train rider, and he was due to leave January 26, 1859. He rode the train with 51 boys, and they arrived in Wabash, Indiana, and were placed with families who lived around the area. Judge John Green of Tipton, Indiana, was the man John was placed with. He and his wife, Mary, had 2 other children living with them. Little John Brady became John Green Brady. John graduated from Yale College in 1874 with the help of Judge Green and wife Mary. He went on to attend the Union Theological Seminary and graduated in 1877. He moved to Texas for a time, but eventually left for Alaska. Alaska was purchased by the United States a decade prior, in 1867. John organized the Sitka Boys' Home under the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions. He did not stay very long. He had disagreements with the trade training for the boys and profit margins. He became an independent missionary and worked full-time for a trading company. John took an interest in politics, and in 1884, he was appointed to the Sitka Commissariat. John married in 1887 to a woman named Elizabeth Patton, and they had 5 children. John went on and campaigned for governor, and in June of 1897 he was appointed as governor of Alaska Territory by President McKinley. John was a huge promoter of Alaska's natural resources, and he helped expand and settle the Alaskan Territory. He called for statehood starting in 1899. He was reappointed in 1900 and 1904 as governor by President McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. John met Teddy in 1900 and told him about his encounter with his father in New York all those years earlier. In 1905, John invested in the Reynolds Alaska Development Company. Now, he was open about this, and he let them advertise using his name. Some folks saw this as a conflict of interest, so he resigned as governor in 1906. The community was outraged, but he denied any wrongdoings. The company crashed in 1907, and John lost everything he had invested. He worked for years to restore the investments that others had lost due to his endorsement of the Reynolds Company. John left Alaska in 1909. Most of his years were spent traveling around the U.S. lecturing and writing about Alaska. The Children's Aid Society wrote about John in their annual report as a success story. John returned to Alaska in his later years and died there in 1918. This next story is about John's close friend, Andrew Burke. Andrew was born in 1850. His mother passed away, and when Andrew was 4, his father died as well. He was not old enough to remember either parent. He lived on the streets of New York for some time with thousands of other orphan children who were abandoned. At the age of 6, a police officer took him into a nursery. It was 6 buildings made of stone on Randall's Island. For 3 years, he lived there with 2,000 other children. They were between the ages of 4 to 16 years. When Andrew was there, it was clean and orderly. Mr. Ripley was the headmaster, and the children were taught manners. He would walk the halls for inspections. The nurseries had playgrounds, gymnasiums, and a yard filled with trees. Andrew was thankful for his life at the home. He rode the train with 27 children from New York to Noblesville, Indiana in August of 1859. All the boys and girls were under 12 years of age. They were said to have found good homes for all of them. There was a trial basis set for 4 weeks. Each child received 2 sets of new clothes. The girls received $50 each, and they were allowed to stay in their homes until the age of 18. The boys received $150, and they could stay until the age of 21. Those children changed trains 5 times. Andrew remembers the countryside as a beautiful place. Rolling hills, cattle grazing, rivers and streams, and everything was green. People greeted the children by horse and buggy. They were fed, cleaned, and dressed in the church basement so they could be viewed by the prospective parents. All children were placed that day. Mr. Butler selected Andrew to join his family, but he later found out that some of the orphans were not well cared for. Andrew stated, "Most of us became a part of the community. There was no greater blessing for me than the Children's Aid Society, and I am indebted to the founder, Reverend Charles Loring Brace." In 1862, I left home and I joined the Union Army. I served in the 75th Regiment of the Indiana Infantry. I was only 12 years old. I wasn't old enough to carry a musket. I enlisted as a drummer boy, and I was paid $13 a month. We marched from Louisville to Lebanon. We pursued General Morgan's rebel troops for about 4 months and spent several weeks that winter near Gallatin, Kentucky. I was an errand boy. I scrubbed horses, I scoured pots and pans. But I fell ill in December that year, so I was discharged as disabled on New Year's Day. My infantry went on without me while I recovered, and they are recorded in Civil War history. Andrew married Carrie Cleveland in 1880, and they moved to the Dakota Territory. Andrew was a bookkeeper in a general store and later became a cashier in a bank. He embraced politics and became treasurer of Cass County in 1884, as well as serving 2 more terms. The couple moved to Fargo, and they had twin daughters, Ada and Amy. North Dakota became a state in 1889. Andrew was elected governor in 1890. The family moved around after his years as governor. They moved to Duluth and then Kansas City, Washington, D.C., where he was an inspector of land management. Then they relocated again in 1911 to the territory of New Mexico. He processed applications for citizens who leased federal land for grazing. New Mexico became the 47th state in 1912 under President Taft. Carrie passed away in 1917, and Andrew felt lost without her. A blockage in his intestines took his life November of 1918. He He is buried in Roswell's South Park Cemetery. They said he was loyal to his country and had a vital and striking personality. I'd like to tell you about a child named Alice Bullis Ayler. She spoke at an Orphan Train Heritage Society reunion in 1993 at the age of 74 years old. She was an Orphan Train rider in 1930. Alice was among the last 3 children to travel on the orphan trains. In 1929, she was picked up by the state and placed with the Children's Aid Society with her younger siblings. Alice was living in a tent in a forest in upstate New York with her mom and siblings. She stated, "I was the oldest of 5 children. My father was 25 years older than my mother. My grandma was a flapper and a poor influence on my mother in raising kids, so I took care of my younger siblings." Her sister, the second oldest, had contracted diphtheria and whooping cough, and due to the fever, she had severe brain damage. She had twin brothers who were 3 years old and a younger brother who was 18 months. Her brothers were separated from her and placed in a boys' home. Her sister, having brain damage, went to another home, and she was sent to Goodhue Estate, where she was taught a strong work ethic, manners, and housekeeping. She stated that the home was the Cadillac of schools. It was a finishing school on Staten Island. It was a girls' home. I was glad to have a bed to sleep in. I was fed. I had clean clothes to wear and attended school. There was no welfare or state assistance in those days. Orphans who were picked up were sent to orphan asylums. She remained there for a year, from 1929 to 1930. She was recovering from an illness. She stated, "They needed to fatten me up before sending me out." Her twin brothers rode the train and were placed with a family in Kansas City. Her youngest brother, who was 1.5, was sent to live with 2 deaf and mute parents in Whitfield. The adoptive parents used their bathtub as a playpen, and the child never learned how to speak. When he was 3 years old, the adoptive parents gave him back because they had a child of their own. He ended up being raised in a boys' home. Alice said those were terrible times for her. The stock market crashed the year before, and the Great Depression hit. She rode the train to Kansas. The first home Alice was placed in was a short stay. The second placement, she stayed for 6 years. Her foster family had no understanding for her situation. She had lived with her parents for 9 years, and being given away was a huge impact on her soul. She was advised to not have contact with her birth parents. She stated she was more like a hired hand without pay. At 17, she went to work for JCPenney's and moved out on her own. She married her high school sweetheart, Donald, when she was 20 years old. They had 1 son and adopted a daughter when she was 10 days old. They named her Anne. Her husband became an optometrist. Alice was constantly reading psychology books to help her daughter with her own emotional scarring from being adopted. And Alice was encouraged by Anne's doctor to go to school for psychology. So she received 2 bachelors, one in sociology and one in psychology. And she got her master's in education. She stated, "I spent my whole life proving I didn't have bad blood. I've been married to the same man for 54 years. I proved I have a brain, and I spent my life helping others. Some people are bitter about the trains, but not me. Even though there were hard times, it probably saved my life." Our last orphan train rider is Mary Jane Bod. She traveled to Grand Island, Nebraska in 1912 as a 2-year-old. There would be a family waiting for her when she arrived. 9 children were going west on the train that summer day. Mary Jane was the youngest of the group. She remembers little pieces of the trip. She was placed in the New York orphanage when she was 2 weeks old. She was confined to the Catholic institution for the first 26 months of her life. This was her first trip outdoors. Mary traveled 2.5 days on the train before reaching Nebraska. She recalls being anxious as a child, being pushed through to get off the train. The Kemper family had been selected by the staff to receive Mary as their child. She was spoken for, so she would be bypassing the inspections of fostering parents. When I got off the train, my brother was already looking for me, she stated. Frank Kemper was a 14-year-old. He had expressed to his mother, who was a widow, that he wanted a baby sister. Frank took her under his wing from that day forward. They took her in as a family member and never looked back. She said those were wonderful times, and she was one of the lucky ones. Adelaide, Mary's new mom, and her brother Frank were always good to her, and the town was welcoming as well. But when Mary first arrived, she didn't speak a word for 2 weeks. She was fearful of her new environment. Her mom was worried that she was deaf or mute. 2 weeks in, she finally started talking, and her mom was so relieved. Mary said from that day on, I never shut my mouth. She considered it a happy childhood. The orphanage at the time kept close watch on the children they placed. They visited once a year to check up on the children. Of the 9 children sent to St. Libery, 2 of the children asked to be returned to the orphanage, and 1 child was overworked by the family who took him in, Mary stated. Mary's mom asked her not to search for her birth mom as long as she was alive, so Mary never did. But at 19, Mary needed identification to get married. She sent a letter to the orphanage for her papers. She received her original baptism certificate that somehow bypassed the orphanage. At this moment, Mary knew the town she was born in, which was Waterbury, Connecticut, and her birth mother's name was Mabel Collins. 6 years later, she was now married, and they had 2 children, and both were sons. She was listening to the radio one day, and the winner of a Tide commercial contest was called out. The winner's name was Etta Collins, and she was from Waterbury. It was her birthplace with the same last name as the birth mom. Mary contacted Etta and asked her if she could be related to her. Etta wrote back and said, no, but I know your relatives and the doctor who delivered you. So Etta and Mary stayed in contact and wrote letters. 2 years later, Mary was renting out the family basement to the wife of a GI. One day, the new renter told Mary she needed a companion to travel back east. The renter was pregnant and most likely didn't want to travel alone. The travel expenses would be paid for, so her husband encouraged her to go, so she did. Etta Collins offered for Mary to stay with her. Etta arranged for Mary to meet with the doctor who delivered her. So she showed up for the appointment at 10 a.m., and the doctor thought she should leave well enough alone. Mary said, "Did you ever have a mother?" And he smiled at her. She knew that he understood. He told her about her mother and basically spilled the beans and told her that he knew that her mom was Mabel Collins. Later that day, the doctor called with the address of her half-brother Joseph. They drove to his home. It was a huge mansion with a Cadillac parked outside. All she could think was, all this beauty, and they put me up for an adoption. A woman in her 50s opened the door, and when she asked for Joseph, the woman said, "He's not here, but can I help you?" Mary stared into her eyes and knew this woman was her birth mom. Mary didn't know what to say or what to do. She was taken back by her mother's presence. Mary asked, "Does Joseph know he has a half-sister?" Mabel said, "Oh no, Joseph never had a half-sister." Mary said, "Yes, he did, and I'm the half-sister." The woman standing in the door started crying, and Mary began crying as well, but no one said a word. Mabel never told Mary she was her mom. She never admitted she had an illegitimate child. Before returning home, Mary called her mother and said, "I know who you are. Here's my address. Maybe someday you'll wish you had it." That day, Mary boarded the train, It was the same train she rode when she traveled to meet her family in Grand Island at 2 years of age. She cried the whole way home. There was a letter waiting for her from Mabel. Mabel made small talk in that letter, and over the next 30 years, they corresponded back and forth until Mabel died at the age of 85. Mary said she never did admit that she was my mother. Mary saved all those letters. There were 70 of them. Each letter started with, "My dear Mary." Mary stated that she looked just like me. Some letters made claims as to why Mabel wasn't Mary's mom, but Mabel never told her the truth. There seems to be a strong connection between the large number of mental health asylums for adults and the large number of orphan asylums for children during that time frame. Was there an orchestrated plan to divide poor parents from their children? To re-educate the young to be work mules for a new society? But let's not forget, during the Roaring 20s, heavy drinking and the flapper lifestyle was in full swing in New York City and other large cities. As a result of these times, many unwanted pregnancies occurred. Illegitimate children were not really accepted back then, and so a lot of times the mothers hid the fact and gave their children up for adoption. What about the Native Americans in the asylums that were created for them? The schools where Native American children were forced into classrooms. I realize the immigrants who came to America were hit with famine and conflicts of wars, as well as disease in their homelands. But where does the destruction begin and end? Who started the wars and why? When they arrived in America, migrants were inspected and some were separated from their loved ones. Adults who appeared ill were placed in hospitals. Ones who appeared mentally ill were sent to mental health asylums. So where did all the thousands of children go when this happened? If one parent remained with the children, they were forced into low-paying jobs with long hours, which in turn left the children to fend for themselves on the streets. The divide of the wealthy and the struggling to survive was immense. We're left with more questions than answers. Some see adoptions, orphanages, and the trains as a child trafficking movement. We should all dig deeper into these topics because it didn't end with the trains when they stopped running. In the 1950s, we learned of women and men like Georgia Tann and Bessie Bernard with their black market baby rings. Let's keep researching our history. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
It's so unnecessary dwelling about the past, 'cause I know that God is good, He led me to where I'm at. Sometimes I feel like giving up, you're giving in, but everything happens for a reason. It won't always be blue skies ahead. Sometimes you might need a helping hand, just like iron sharpens iron, making me stronger, calling me higher. When we come together, just like iron sharpens iron, making us stronger, calling us higher. When we're helping each other, we're growing.